Welcome back, kitty cats. For those of you who are new here, my name is Rowan Garlow and I'm a trauma recovery practitioner. And today we're talking about reparenting. What is reparenting? How do we do it? Why would we want to do it? Everything about reparenting. Now, specifically reparenting yourself. And what we're talking about could definitely apply to the context of a person with a practitioner or a therapist. That's actually originally how reparenting came about, was that the therapist would take on the role of the parent to help the client develop through these emotional and developmental stuck points so that they could progress forward. And for the sake of this, we're talking about reparenting yourself. But there's so much to unpack here, so let's jump right in. Okay, so first and foremost, what is a parenting style? A parenting style are the behaviors and attitudes that a parent has towards a child. It's essentially the strategies that are used in this child rearing process. Now, what's interesting about parenting styles is that they're different from attachment styles. So I can give you a little piece of research, which is just a little nugget about how these two things are slightly different, which I'm going to link down below. And I plan to talk about attachment styles in the future. But for now, this is just about parenting styles. And the piece of research that I'm linking down below talks about how the hypothesis was that parenting styles and attachment styles would actually run parallel to each other. So we would see this, this parenting style and this attachment style lining up. But what we found was that that really wasn't always the case. There was definitely overlap between the two, obviously, but that they weren't completely parallel to each other. And what the research was offering or suggesting was that this might be because parenting styles are something that maybe come on a little bit later as the child starts to get older. These are more, parenting styles are sometimes more involved with discipline. So it's about the responsiveness. I mean, it has to do with the emotional responsiveness, the warmth or coldness of a caregiver, which could happen starting from birth, but sometimes those more like the control and demandingness, which is the other factor that we use to talk about parenting styles. And so it's warmth and responsiveness is one determining criteria for a parenting style. Is it high or low in that? And then demandingness is the other criteria. Is it high in demandingness or low in demandingness? What they're suggesting is that this maybe demandingness or that behavior might shift a little bit as the child gets older. And so by that time, a lot of the structures within the child's brain have already formed. And so by that time, trust, initiation, and even possibly self-esteem might be solidified within the personality structure within the psyche. Whereas when we're looking at attachment styles, that's that primary bonding, which happens from day one. So that's just a theory as to why they might not be completely parallel with each other. It would make a lot of sense, right, that the parenting style would kind of overlap a little bit with the attachment style, because you might be able to predict, well, if a parent has a specific bonding pattern, then they might also have a specific parenting style. And we do see that there are patterns with the way that a child is bonded to and what their attachment style typically is, or what their the way that they are parented and how they feel about relationships with other people. So the degree to which a parenting style is going to affect a person, really, I'm not even here to say that. I'm just going to name them, what are they, and make this as fucking simple as possible for you. So before I give you the super simple explanation to how to reparent yourself and find out what your inner parenting style is, there's a couple of things that you should foundationally know or understand, otherwise parts of this video might not make sense to you. So if you don't know about fragmentation, then I have a video about fragmentation. It's like the first video I ever did on my channel. Or you can watch Teal Swan's video titled Fragmentation, the Worldwide Disease, which is where I got that information from. Watch my video on what is parts work, which I'll also put up above, because when we're talking about these internal child-parent structures and the aware ego, we need to know about parts work, because parts work is how, or one of the modalities that we can use to reparent ourselves and to have an understanding of these different aspects of our consciousness and of our psyche. And so another thing that we have to understand and be seeing this and understanding this information through is the concept of fragmentation, like I was talking about. What we know is that the mind naturally uses fragmentation as a coping mechanism. Fragmentation is also a natural mechanism of the universe for becoming self-aware. Now, fragmentation is also a trauma response. So what happens in the moment of trauma is that if we cannot deal with something, we will create multiple points of perspective, essentially. We will fragment into the part of us that can keep us safe in a specific moment. This oftentimes becomes the protector. This is what is shown to the world. And vulnerable, sometimes multiple vulnerable aspects, which may hold the emotions, for example, that the person was not able to connect with or feel in that moment, or not able to handle or work through. This fragmentation, these multiple selves, these inner children, these inner parents, we have to be understanding that we have this whole family system inside of us. So if you're not super familiar with those concepts, I would say check out the parts work video and the fragmentation video, and then come back and watch this. There's a lot of different ways that you could define reparenting, but for the sake of making this very comprehensible, we're going to define reparenting as the aware ego process. So reparenting is essentially the process of becoming aware of, or stepping into the awareness so that you can disidentify from your inner child and your inner parent structure that are already unconsciously existing from the way that they were set up in childhood. And when you reparent, you are shifting the unconscious parent-child dynamic into one that is a conscious model happening in relationship from your aware ego. So basically it's happening from your aware ego. Your aware ego is having a relationship with the parenting structure, because the aware ego is all of the parts in the system. It's able to witness from a space of neutrality and work with these different energies. And so part of reparenting is becoming aware of and disidentified enough from the inner child and the inner parent to recognize that they are the inner child and the inner parent, which is part of realizing that you are you are a fragmented system, essentially. And when you integrate these unconscious inner parents and inner children, we're not getting rid of them. They don't just dissolve completely into the system. But when we integrate them into our conscious awareness, which means now we can hear them, we can see them, feel them, and we can now act in accordance with their best interests in a way that we were not able to do before. Because there was just an unconscious program that was playing out, parent-child dynamics. Basically, reparenting yourself is important because the chances that you adopted your parents' parenting style are pretty high. And if you adopted that parenting style internally, then that means that's how you're treating your own inner child. And that structure needs to shift. And the only way that we can shift that structure is through becoming conscious of it and through uncovering aspects within our being that we are disconnected from, that we didn't even know were there, that can actually come in and step in as conscious parents or as the authoritative parent role. Another way to think about this is like when we're reparenting, we are changing the recipe that makes up our internal family system soup. That recipe is going to need to shift depending on what end of the spectrum you're on. First, let's imagine that you had an authoritarian parent. This is sort of the military parent. And typically the attachment style that's associated with this, right? The no hard and fast rules here, but typically an authoritarian parenting style breeds an avoidant child. So in the authoritarian parenting style recipe, it is high in demandingness and low in emotional responsiveness and warmth. This person might be somebody who ends up being passive because they've literally just been beaten down, or they could go the other way and be rebellious, but typically we see a child being like kind of a passive good girl or good boy, with this authoritarian, regime. But of course, right, that sort of bilateral way that we work here within this time-space reality of duality, people could obviously go the other way. So with this authoritarian soup, we've got high in demandingness, low in emotional warmth. So what is this person going to need? They're going to need a little bit of leniency, a little bit of that, and a little bit of more emotional responsivity and warmth. And that is going to help to balance out those energies. So those are two qualities that their internal parenting structure are lacking. So on the other end of the spectrum, we have the permissive parent, who is sort of like the friend. They're warm, maybe loving even, but they really don't have any sort of demands for mature behaviors from their child. So this can sort of lead to an inner child archetype, like a Peter Pan, for example, who wants to be a child forever and doesn't grow up, and oftentimes can even lack the skill set to be able to function like an adult in society because they haven't had to. And so if there's an internal permissive parenting style that's happening, there's going to need to be a little bit of coolness added to this recipe, and just a little bit more of demandingness and structure and responsibility added to the recipe. That's what's so cool about these different parenting styles, is that because they're operating on a spectrum, they're also polarities. And so authoritarian and permissive are polarities. If you have a largely permissive internal parenting structure, well, then you need to be integrating that authoritarian polarity, right? We don't want to go all the way over here or all the way over here. The third parenting style, which is considered like not great, it's pretty scientific, is the uninvolved parenting style. And that's just low in warmth, low in demandingness. I forgot to mention that with the uninvolved parent, that's no rules and cold, that's what typically breeds an anxious attachment style, sort of like abandonment and anxiety.
Hey Mom. Hey Mom, I've got a question. Hey, Mom, could I ask you something? Could I have a question?
Godfrey, did you hear something? I thought I heard something. No. I think we should make a coffee. Don't you think? That would be nice.
The last parenting style is authoritative, which is considered to be high in demandingness and high in warmth, which is supposed to be considered like this. But I think that now that we're moving into this whole conscious parenting model, and as our species is evolving, authoritative is like, we could do a little bit better than that. I think that being super high and demanding, it's not great. I don't see how that could be super great. So to me, it seems like the integrated way would be like that center point between the intersection of them all, where that beautiful place where we can consciously allow this unique bud of a human being to blossom. What are some reasons why a person would want to reparent themselves? Maybe your relationships are crappy, or you struggle in your relationships because the internal relationships are not great, and your inner children are popping off everywhere, and your inner parents are putting the hammer down or not putting it down enough. Maybe you have difficulty regulating your emotions. The old parenting style isn't holding up for the inner children anymore. Really never was. It totally got you through, but you know what I mean. Your life feels out of balance. You feel like you're too far this way or too far this way, overly rigid or not rigid enough. Maybe you have a difficult time meeting your needs or even identifying what they are. You either find yourself completely drowning in your emotions, or you find yourself being super hypercritical of yourself all the time, or you're just alive, because if you're alive, then you probably need to reparent yourself. Maybe you're wondering, where do parenting styles come from? Why did my parents have the parenting style that they had? Well, if you had the authoritarian dad, the military dad or mom, then that might have been because that was one of their parents. Or they were completely patterned in the opposite way, and so they swung their parenting style to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Or they might be responding directly to a trigger that you create in them. And so when we talk about behaviors that parents have towards children, well, if it's in the arena of like discipline, then how that parent is going to choose to discipline, or which child they choose to discipline, might have to do sometimes with specific dynamics that are being played out between parent and child. Let's say, for example, that you have a mother with a child who's continuously saying no and asserting a boundary. Now, let's say that this mother keeps experiencing anger every time this child says no, and then has a parenting style that becomes authoritarian in that moment as a byproduct of the trigger for the child saying no. Why? Because let's say that this particular parent never got to assert their own boundaries and their own inner child never gets to say no. And so when they see their reflection outside of themselves getting to express a boundary and getting to disrupt their own boundaries, because if a toddler's saying no and refusing to do something and it's impeding her ability to get something done that she needs to get done, and that anger is going to come up in response to her own lack of boundaries. And so in that moment, her parenting style might reflect the trigger and the internal version of her own parent that comes forward to treat that child the same way that she treats her own inner child who is not allowed to have boundaries, if that makes sense. Because remember, mom and dad or primary caregivers, they did the same thing. They internalized their own parents inside of them. And so they're, probably unconsciously acting out the same thing that we are. So I would be curious over the next few days about where in your life your internal mother and father might be showing up. Where in your life an actual version of your parents or your primary caregivers might be showing up in the way that you interact with yourself and other people. Okay, so within this internal structure, we have this internal mother and this internal father, or whoever these primary caregivers are. Now, this is where it gets maybe a little bit complicated for people, because they're like, well, how do I know which parenting style I have? Well, you probably have both, depending on what your parents or caregivers were like. It's pretty uncommon that people will have two authoritarian parents. You'll oftentimes see one permissive parent and one authoritarian parent, the same way that you'll often see a narcissist and a codependent, or a anxious attachment style and an avoidant attachment style person. So we see these polarities the same way that it would show up. So go back and look at your primary caregivers. Were they uninvolved, authoritative, authoritarian, or permissive? Or were they maybe even a combination of two of those? And look for those similar patterns within yourself. You know how you were cared for, so look for the ways in which you are caring for yourself that way. Maybe even make a list of all of the traits and parenting behaviors that your parents or caregivers had growing up. See if you can notice how any of the things that you wrote down apply to how you treat or take care of yourself. So I think it's more important that we look at this like a soup, like a recipe that we can add things to and tweak, instead of something that is black and white. Before I go into exactly how do we reparent, I want to briefly touch on the different inner child archetypes because it's just super fun. And I want to just say how important, this newer conscious parenting model is, because conscious parenting is really about emotional regulation without disconnection and without shaming. So if we could have or adopt an inner conscious parent for our inner children, that would be the ideal situation. So conscious parenting is really about the parent being able to have themselves, their own boundaries, regulate their own system, and also be able to be with the child. This is like when we're talking about an actual parent and child relationship. The parent is not forcing their own expectations as to how the child should be behaving, but they are present and willing to show up for any emotional experience that might arise. And they're not focused on just making the child happy, but they're focused on really supporting the child and being able to develop and grow through challenges. So they're not just like giving the child like a sucker in the middle of something and saying, here you go, I'm going to distract you with this. It's really looking at what led up to this, what's the bigger picture, how can I make sense of this and help the child connect to and make sense of this and their emotions. So, conscious parenting really could have a whole video dedicated to it, but for now, we'll go into the inner child archetypes and then how exactly do we reparent. Okay, I'm going to go through these relatively briefly so that we can really get to the meat of how do we reparent. One of the examples of an inner child that we could have is the wounded child. This is the aspect of us. By the way, an inner child, oh my God, this is so important. How did I not define this until now? An inner child is the part of our consciousness or psyche that is holding all of our childhood experiences, both positive and negative, most simply put, unconscious and conscious. So an example of a type of inner child we could have is the wounded inner child. This is the inner child that is feeling maybe stuck, powerless, hopeless. They can oftentimes feel abandoned and not taken care of. And they're sensitive to the pain and emotions of other people, which could be a problem because they could end up confusing their emotions with other people's emotions. The next one is the enlightened wounded child, which is this inner archetype of the wounded child who is then able to alchemize into this enlightened wounded child, which can walk through the pain and the fire and can end up being a really great healer. And so the next inner child archetype is the divine child. Think of the divine child as the surreal, divinely connected inner child. And typically you'll not see this as a primary self because oftentimes the inner child is wounded, and so it's not feeling really capable of taking care of itself or even capable of this carrying out this divinity. This archetype is often overwhelmed with negative energies and feels incapable of defending themselves, and they may become easily enraged in the face of evil or negative or bad energy. Next we have the nature child, and the nature child is connected to plants and animals and nature, obviously. And the shadow side of this is that they could end up taking out some of their aggression on nature or punishing themselves with nature, which I was really confused about that. I was like, what do? You force yourself to stand out in a hurricane and punish yourself that way? I don't know.
You've been a bad boy, Jenkins. Go stand in the fucking tsunami.
Next is the magical child, which is an enchanted child who can see life through a world of possibilities, And the shadow side of this is that they might become cynical or squashed out, and they might want to, spend hours fantasizing in movies or games or role-playing Dungeons and Dragons, who knows. Next we have the eternal child. He's like, I'm gonna be Peter Pan forever. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, and we know what young forever means. Not gonna be reliable and responsible, perhaps, right? That's a great thing. It's great to be Peter Pan. It's great to be a child, but they might have a hard time with other people having personal boundaries, and they might maybe rely on other people to just pick up the slack for them. And finally, the archetype that we have is the orphan child. Of course, there's probably 100,000 other archetypes, but these are the main ones for the sake of this. So, the orphan child is like the abandoned child, the one that feels like never fit in. Nobody wants me. They're typically very independent, which can be fantastic because they've fostered this great skill to be able to live life and do it up. They might even be successful people, but they feel alone and isolated at the end of the day. They may not allow loved ones in, and they might try to seek a surrogate family, which said that was like, when I was reading that, it was like, oh yeah, well, they might seek a surrogate family because they're trying to compensate for something. Well, yeah, I would say find a surrogate family. We should all do that because surrogate families can sometimes be better than the first one. Moving into how do we do this? How do we reparent ourselves? How do we know that an inner child is present? An inner child is present when we're having a distressing situation, when we're triggered. And then we got to figure out, how do we respond to that internally? What is our natural mode of operandi? So my first advice about reparenting is to first go into each of your parents or your primary caregivers. So do parts work with the part of you that is both of your primary caregivers. If you only had one, then just go into the one. That's the first step. Figure out what's happening in the world of those internal parents. And this is the aware ego process, because as you're doing parts work, you are stepping back into the center, into the aware ego, and thus you're having an awareness of those parts. You're not those parts are operating through you as the aware ego. The more that you're able to separate from these internal parents through this aware ego process, the greater chance that you have of having a direct relationship to the inner child and the vulnerability, because the inner parents oftentimes act as a protector or a buffer to the vulnerability or the inner child. The inner child creates the inner parent. You as a child create the inner parent. The inner child creates the inner parent. And then the aware ego has to get to that vulnerability. So first we have to acknowledge that we have an inner child. We have multiple inner children. We have to acknowledge the vulnerability and validate the emotions that are coming up within us. And we have to figure out what need is not being met that needs to be met. So just something as simple as those 3 steps: acknowledge, validate, and curiously find out what are the unmet needs and meet those needs. That simple kind of 3-step breakdown can be done within parts work, that can be done within completion process, or any other modality that's designed to help you have awareness about yourself and your own emotions. The next thing I want to give you is a 5-step process that was given to me by a conscious parent herself, Mandy J., a friend of mine. And I'm going to give you an example to go along with this. Okay, so Mandy and her 2-year-old daughter were in her daughter's bedroom. And Mandy needed to leave, and so she shut the closet door. And as soon as she shut the closet door, her little girl started screaming bloody murder. And she realized very quickly, because she was actually attuned, that she was screaming because she had closed the door and her little girl had wanted to get books out of there, and she was pissed because she wasn't going to be able to get the books and they needed to leave. So first of all, we just have to note that it takes, when we're dealing with toddlers and when we're dealing with internal parts, sometimes that are nonverbal, it takes a certain level of attunement to be able to figure out what is happening. So knowing that she was attuned, she goes, okay, I'm going to mirror the emotion. Step 1, you are upset right now because I closed the closet door and you wanted to get your books out. The next step is validate the emotions. That makes perfect sense that you're upset right now because I'm closing the closet doors and you want to get something out of there. I would be upset too. So again, you're doing that with yourself. The third step is empathy and attunement and holding space. So this is a really important part of the process because this is that phase where we're not really doing anything. We're just sort of pausing and waiting for the system to settle. We're saying, hey, I'm right here. I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm not going to invade your space. I'm not going to leave you. I'm just right here. We wait for the system to deactivate. When it feels like there's we don't want to rush anything, then we can give some tools for healthy expression. So this is step 4, tools and healthy expression. So does that mean we stomp it out? Does that mean we write something down? Does that mean that we scream in our car? There's some way to move that energy. And right, when we're working with ourselves, we might not wait for that lull. We might, part of that attunement and that loving attention with ourselves might be allowing our impulses to come through as they're coming through. And then still sitting with our system as it's down regulating and then waiting for another impulse. And so number 4, the tools in healthy expression, with the example of my friend, her little girl is like kind of limited with verbal skills, but she gave her an option for how to physically express that emotion, I believe. And so number 5 is then sports casting, which is an opportunity to restate your boundary and to apologize. So in this situation, she said, I'm really sorry that I had to close the closet door, but we do need to leave. And when we come back, how about we can take out a book then? So there's an opportunity to meet the person halfway, also while maintaining your boundary, right? Because she still needs to go to the store. But maybe there's a way that we can also make sure that the other person gets their needs met, right? And so as that model relates to ourselves, we can both have this internal conscious parent who's able to give this experience to our inner child, but then who's also able to go out into relationships and do the same thing for other people, and who's able to protect the boundaries of the inner children and the inner selves. We have multiple parents, multiple inner protectors. So as we're coming to a close here, I want you to think about all the different areas of your life in which this maybe negative parenting style could be showing up. So it could show up in our physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual life. And think about like what kind of things need to be added to your recipe to make your life more sustainable and supported and fulfilled. Is that adding more of this discipline, more of this, harder, structured, masculine energy? Is it more of adding more feminine, nurturing, alchemizing kind of energy, emotional energy to your constitution? What do you need to be adding? And when we think about these things that we are adding or allowing space to emerge, we could think about bringing in a divine mother and a divine father. And so another really cool thing that we can do, like with parts work, what I was saying before about getting in contact with your internal caregivers, is to go into, even if you don't have a solid reference for it, your internal divine mother and divine father. And one of the things that I did with my practitioner was to have this sort of idea. I had this idea in my mind about maybe what divine masculine father would be like. And so I sort of had this image and I said, okay, I'm choose with my conscious free will. I'm going to step into the part of me that is this divine father or this energy that I had an idea about, but I didn't really have an experiential experience of it, just like an idea. But that energy exists in me, right? Because all of the energies exist in you. So I step into that, I come in contact with, for the first time consciously, this aspect of myself. And I was really able to have an experience with this energy. And now that I'm connecting with it from the aware ego more and more, strengthening this divine father within my constitution. So you can do that with divine mother, divine father. And again, maybe just focusing on one specific area, like just my physical life. How does my internal parenting style show up in my physical life? Am I just uninvolved with my physical body, with my physical upkeeping of this vessel? Am I permissive of it, or am I authoritarian? And what am I like with my mental health? What am I like with my emotions? And when we feel into that, we know what pieces of the puzzle we're needing, what ingredients. And we can bring in the new conscious parent and those new energies through an aware ego process, like voice dialogue or parts work. And through becoming aware and observing what's happening, we can create a relationship to our actual vulnerability. Because remember, right, we have both the internal reaction and response, which is the child self, and the style or the parent inside of us as well. So we have both pieces. And becoming aware of them means that now we know what recipe we have and we know what we need because we're connected to it. So I hope I made this topic, which I think is kind of complex, somewhat simple and easy to understand and digest. And thank you so much for showing up and for watching and being interested. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video.